Over the last 10 years or so, naval experts and military historians have complained about corruption of the rules for naming U.S. Navy ships. Their complaints in turn caused several lawmakers to charge the Congressional Research Service with looking into the issue. And the result is this white paper CRS just published titled Navy Ship Names, Background for Congress. Let's start by reviewing the basic rules the Navy has established for naming ships. SSBN 826 class ballistic missile submarines and SSN 774 class attack submarines are named for states. Aircraft carriers are named for past U.S. presidents. Destroyers are named for deceased heroic members of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, including secretaries of the Navy. FFG-62 class frigates are named for the first 6 U.S. Navy ships authorized by Congress in 1794, and the first 3 have been named Constellation, Congress, and Chesapeake. Littoral combat ships are named for regionally important U.S. cities and communities. Amphibious assault ships are named for U.S. Marine Corps battles, early U.S. Navy sailing ships, or aircraft carriers from World War II. LPD-17 class amphibious ships are named for major U.S. cities and communities attacked on September 11, 2001. A law approved in 1819 stated, quote, that all of the ships of the Navy of the United States now building or hereafter to be built shall be named by the Secretary of the Navy under the direction of the President of the United States, taking care that no 2 vessels in the Navy shall bear the same name, end quote. For most of the 19th century, U.S. law included language explicitly assigning the Secretary of the Navy the task of naming new Navy ships, but in 1925 the reference to the Secretary of the Navy disappeared from the U.S. Code. Since that time, SECNAV's authority to name new Navy ships is codified by Title 10, which is the part of the U.S. Code that deals with the armed forces, Section 8662, Subtitle C, which restates that no 2 ships can have the same name and that SECNAV can change the names of vessels. A 2015 amendment to Section 8662, which we'll call the MABUS rule, states that the Secretary of the Navy may not announce or implement any proposal to name a vessel of the Navy until 30 days after the date on which the Secretary submits to the Committees on the Armed Services of the Senate and the House of Representatives a report setting forth such a proposal. More details on where that came from in a bit. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the Navy's in-house Office of Professional Historians, cites the above-mentioned laws and states the following. As with many other things, the procedures and practices involved in Navy ship naming are much, if not more, products of evolution and tradition than of legislation. Each year, the Naval History and Heritage Command compiles primary and alternate ship name recommendations and forwards these to the Chief of Naval Operations by way of the chain of command. The Chief of Naval Operations signs the memorandum recommending names for the current year's building program and sends it to the Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary considers these nominations, along with others he receives, as well as his own thoughts in this matter. While there is no set time for assigning a name, it is customarily done before the ship is christened. While the Navy has attempted to be systematic in naming its ships, like all institutions, it has been subject to evolutionary change, and the name sources of the Navy's ships have not been immune to this change, which is a polite way of saying politics can and will wind up informing the process. For instance, in April of 1982, House Speaker Tip O'Neill asked the Reagan White House to change the name of the Navy's new nuclear submarine from the USS Corpus Christi to another title less offensive to Christian groups. The Ad Hoc Corpus Christi Campaign, a group consisting of various Catholic and Protestant laymen and clergy, opposed the submarine's name because Corpus Christi is Latin for Body of Christ. O'Neill, who was Roman Catholic, suggested that the submarine be renamed the USS City of Corpus Christi. Navy Secretary John Lehman, who's Catholic, defended the name USS Corpus Christi, saying the submarine was not named for religious purposes, but for the Texas city. He told O'Neill that other ships in the Navy's history have carried the name USS Corpus Christi. President Reagan ultimately sided with O'Neill and ordered the name changed to City of Corpus Christi despite Lehman's objections. But perhaps no Secretary of the Navy has been more criticized for ship naming in modern times than Ray Mabus, who had the job basically all of President Barack Obama's 2 terms in office. Coming into the role, Mabus stated that one of his primary goals was developing a more diverse force, which a large number of critics, both active duty and former military, labeled as social engineering. He ended the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy towards gay servicemen and women in 2011. That same year, he allowed women to serve on submarines. He pushed for unisex uniforms in the Navy and the United States Marine Corps. In July of 2015, he expanded the maternity leave policy of the Navy Department personnel to 18 weeks. After the Marine Corps released the results of a 9-month-long study on female performance in the Corps, that concluded that the average woman recruit was injured twice as often as men, less accurate with infantry weapons, and not as effective at recovering wounded troops from the battlefield, Mabus immediately dismissed the findings and ordered the Commandant of the Marine Corps to draft a plan to make all of its training co-ed within 15 days and directed the service to make all job titles gender neutral. He also dedicated a large percentage of the Navy's budget to the creation of a green fleet, which critics said at the time was nothing more than him forcing his progressive sensibilities on the sea service in a way that hazarded readiness. So maybe it's no surprise that against this backdrop, Mabus's use of the Secretary of the Navy's ship naming power created controversy. The first such furor on his watch happened in April of 2010 when his office announced that the San Antonio-class amphibious ship LPD-17 would be named in honor of Democratic Congressman John Murtha, who was a longtime supporter of the Navy and the Marine Corps. What the CRS report calls orthodox traditionalists decried the development as an unwarranted intrusion of politics and a corruption of the LPD-17 naming convention, which, as stated at the outset, is major U.S. cities and communities attacked on September 11, 2001. The CRS report sort of defends Mabus and states that the criticism of his choice in this case is selective interpretation of the historical record and that it was perfectly consistent with the special cross-type naming convention that honors legislative branch members who have been closely identified with military and naval affairs. But the existence of that controversy didn't deter Mabus from invoking his power going forward. In fact, he pushed the envelope even further. On February 10, 2012, Mabus announced that the Navy was naming LCS-10 for former Representative Gabrielle Gifford instead of a regionally important U.S. city. Gabby Giffords was serving her third term as a congresswoman from Arizona when she was shot in the head outside a Safeway grocery store in a suburban area northwest of Tucson during her first Congress in Your Corner speech. A man named Jared Lee Loeffner ran up to the crowd and began firing a 9mm pistol with a 33-round magazine, hitting 19 people and killing 6. Among them, federal judge John Roll and a 9-year-old child, Christina Taylor Green, who was the granddaughter of Major League Baseball manager and general manager Dallas Green. Giffords is married to Senator Mark Kelly, the former Navy A-6 pilot and NASA astronaut, who is twin brothers with Scott Kelly, the former F-14 pilot and NASA astronaut who I flew with and who's been on my channel a couple of times. In the wake of Gabby's hard road to recovery from her brain injuries and subsequent retirement from Congress, she and her husband have become strong gun control advocates, which has earned Senator Kelly the ire of those who are concerned about the loss of Second Amendment rights. Again, the rule for littoral combat ships is they are supposed to be named for regionally important U.S. cities and communities. Critics charged Mabus with projecting his own progressive political sensibilities on the Navy, and historians complained it was a violation on the Navy's own rules in a way that lacked long-term context. Historians also said it was wrong for the Navy to name the ship after a living person, but that charge ignored the fact that the Henry M. Jackson, Carl Vinson, John C. Stennis, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush were all named for prominent politicians who were still alive at the time of the naming. Historians who say the Navy never names ships after living people are correct if they're referring to the period between 1814 and November 18, 1973, when President Nixon announced the naming of the aircraft carrier Carl Vinson. But if not, they're ignoring the fact that among the Navy's earliest vessels after the Revolutionary War were the George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. All three namesakes who were very much alive when those ships put to sea for the first time. For reference, here's the CRS list of ships named for persons who were living at the time of christening since 1973. There are 28 of them. But back to the Giffords. The fact is, Mabus's first choice for the name of LCS-10 was the USS Tucson, which was in keeping with the rule for that class of ship. But one of the submariners on his staff pointed out that that name wasn't available because there was already a Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine named Tucson. So that's when he decided to go with Giffords instead. Which brings up another naming challenge that Secretary Mabus faced on his watch. Remember, the original law from 1819 stated that no two vessels in the Navy shall bear the same name. On December 14, 2016, Secretary Mabus announced that SSBN A-26, the first of a planned class of at least 12 new ballistic missile submarines, would be named Columbia, in honor of the District of Columbia. But on June 3rd of 2022, Mabus announced that he was modifying SSBN A-26's name from Columbia to District of Columbia to avoid an overlap in names with the USS Columbia, SSN 771, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine that was named for Columbia, South Carolina, Columbia, Illinois, and Columbia, Missouri.
So we became the originals, right. And we had to change our name, actually. Well, there's another group in the East End called the Originals, and we had to rename ourselves.
But the most intense criticism of Mabus's naming choices came when on January 6, 2016, he announced that the Navy's new oilers would be named for, quote, people who fought for civil rights and human rights, end quote, and that the first ship in the class, TAO 205, would be named for Representative John Lewis. A few months after that, Mabus announced the names of the next 5 ships in the class, TAO 206 through 210, respectively, Harvey Milk, Earl Warren, Robert F. Kennedy, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth. Of those names, Harvey Milk's generated the most pushback. Milk served as a diving officer on a submarine rescue ship during the Korean War, but he was forced to resign from the U.S. Navy when his superiors caught him in a park that was popular with gay men. After that, he moved from New York to San Francisco and became a prominent voice in the fledgling gay rights movement there. He was elected as a city supervisor and used that position to enact gay rights legislation. On November 27, 1978, he was murdered in his office in City Hall by a former supervisor named Dan White. In 2008, a major motion picture called Milk was released with Sean Penn in the role of Harvey Milk, and that movie raised awareness of Milk's life among average Americans. The San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 2012 urged Mabus to name a ship after Milk, and he agreed. And 4 years later, the action was actually carried out. What supporters framed as vindication, critics claimed was progressive narrative politics, and that while Milk's lifetime of gay rights advocacy may merit respect, it didn't rise to the level of honoring him in this way. After Mabus named a destroyer and an auxiliary ship after longtime Senate Armed Services Chairman Carl Levin and Labor leader Cesar Chavez, respectively, congressional Republicans joined the chorus of those who accused SECNAV of politicizing the ship naming process, and Representative Stephen Palazzo tried to add language to that year's defense appropriations bill that would bar the Secretary from naming ships after people who had never served in the military. Secretary Mabus countered Palazzo's attempt with the fact that both Milk and Chavez were military veterans, Chavez having served in the Navy at the end of World War II. The Lewis class of auxiliary ships have continued to generate controversy with their names, most recently after current Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro, himself a Naval Academy graduate, announced that TAO 212, the 8th ship in the class, would be named for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the first Jewish female Supreme Court justice who passed away in September of 2020. The U.S. Navy's most powerful ships, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, have not been immune from naming controversies. During World War II, aircraft carriers were named for early American Navy ships like Hornet, Wasp, and Enterprise, or battles like Yorktown and Lexington. With the Nimitz class, the convention became naming carriers after deceased U.S. presidents, a rule that was broken right out of the gate when the first ship in the line was named for an admiral and not a president. The next one was named Eisenhower, and then President Nixon broke the rule by naming the one after that, CVN-70, after Carl Vinson, a congressman from Georgia who served for 50 years, 20 of them as the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. During that time, Vinson oversaw the modernization of the military as its focus shifted to the Cold War. He was also committee chair when Congress authorized the procurement of the first nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, starting with the USS Enterprise, CVN-65, in the late 1950s. But he was never president. Critics were also upset that he was alive when he was given the honor. In fact, Congressman Vinson attended the launch of CVN-70 at the age of 96. The next 3 Nimitz-class carriers followed the rule, commissioned as Roosevelt, Lincoln, and Washington. But even one of those 3 wasn't without controversy. In the early 80s, Congress passed a resolution that proposed honoring Hyman G. Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, by naming CVN-72 after him. But that idea was stymied by then Secretary of the Navy John Lehman because Rickover was still alive, wasn't a former president, and had frequently been insubordinate to and generally argumentative with the Secretary. In fact, the relationship got so bad that ultimately Lehman forced Rickover into retirement in the spring of 1985 with the approval of President Reagan. Rickover did not go quietly, however, and during a subsequent meeting in the Oval Office attended by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Lehman, Rickover called Lehman, quote, a pissant who knows nothing about the Navy, end quote, and, quote, a goddamn liar, end quote.
That's a damn lie. I saw him with my own eye.
Despite that episode, even though Lehman didn't want an aircraft carrier named for Rickover, he told Congress that the admiral deserved to have a submarine named after him. As a result, Lehman ordered that the name of SSN-709, a Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine, be changed post-commissioning from USS Providence, which had complied with that class's naming convention, to the USS Hyman G. Rickover. And then he decided that CVN-72 would be named the Abraham Lincoln. A couple of years later, after Congress approved funding for CVN-74, which was the 7th Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, President Reagan was preparing for a speech at a dinner in D.C. honoring retired Mississippi Senator John C. Stennis. He charged his speechwriter and others on his staff with coming up with a hook for his remarks, something that would be a surprise and remembered for years afterwards. One of the staffers offered the idea of announcing the naming of a Navy ship after him, considering his pro-military voting record during his 41 years in the Senate. And even though Stennis was still living and a lifelong Democrat, Reagan liked the idea. And so at the dinner, the president made this announcement.
Senator Stennis, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to announce tonight that as an expression of the nation's gratitude for the public service of the man we honor tonight, the Navy's next nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, CVN-74, will be christened the USS John C. Stennis.
That choice, which surprised the Navy at the time Reagan made the announcement, drew immediate fire because of Stennis' civil rights voting record. The man who the president called an unwavering advocate of peace through strength was known by his critics as an unrepentant segregationist who opposed every civil rights act that came up during his time in the Senate. He also voted against establishing Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a national holiday, and once told Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who was chief of naval operations at the time, that black people had, quote, come down from the trees a lot later than we did, end quote. Other controversies surrounding the naming of Nimitz-class carriers followed. The next one, CVN-75, was authorized by Congress and had the keel laid down as the USS United States, but that name was changed to the Harry S. Truman in February of 1995 at the direction of President Bill Clinton's Secretary of the Navy at the time, John H. Dalton. The name change upset naval historians who pointed out that the name United States was a tribute to the first class of supercarriers that were planned by James Forrestal as the Cold War cooked off after World War II. After the keel was laid down on the lead ship in the class, the USS United States, the program was canceled by President Harry S. Truman, who also fired Forrestal for supporting his opponent during the most recent presidential campaign. Despondent, Forrestal subsequently committed suicide by jumping out the window of his hospital room in the tower of the Bethesda Medical Center. Forrestal class of carriers, the first supercarriers that were actually commissioned, were named in his honor. Truman was generally viewed by U.S. Navy leaders in the late 40s as anti-Navy and pro-Air Force, a brand new service created during his presidency out of the Army Air Corps to deal with the Soviet nuclear threat. So naming a carrier the Harry S. Truman, while in keeping with the Nimitz-class convention, was viewed by Orthodox traditionalists as either tone-deaf or an insult to the Navy by a presidential administration that had a reputation for being anti-military. So speaking about the Harry S. Truman, you guys have probably noticed that I often wear this Harry S. Truman Strike Group ball cap. This was given to me by a member of the crew at a book signing for Punk's War back when it was originally published. This was in Norfolk in 2001. I really like this hat. Also, I have some of the first F-14 arrested landings aboard Harry S. Truman when that ship was first commissioned in the late 90s. CVN-76 was named for President Ronald Reagan while he was still alive, although suffering from severe dementia when the honor was announced. The congressional record shows that the last Nimitz-class carrier, CVN-77, was originally slated to be named Lexington, but that was changed in late 2002 to the USS George H.W. Bush by Gordon England, who was President George W. Bush's Secretary of the Navy at the time. While George H.W. Bush's experiences as a torpedo bomber pilot during World War II, as well as a lifetime of government service, which included being director of the CIA, vice president during the Reagan administration, and the 41st president of the United States, inarguably made him worthy of having an aircraft carrier named after him, the fact that it happened during his son's presidency and while he was still alive opened the choice up to charges of nepotism. On January 16, 2007, Secretary Mabus announced that CVN-78, the lead ship in the new CVN-78 class, would be named for President Gerald R. Ford. On May 29, 2011, Mabus announced that CVN-79, the second ship in the class, would be named for President John F. Kennedy. On December 1, 2012, Secretary Mabus announced that CVN-80, the third ship in the class, would be named Enterprise. Mabus made the announcement on the same day that he deactivated the 51-year-old aircraft carrier CVN-65, also named Enterprise. CVN-80 is the 9th U.S. Navy ship to be named Enterprise. None of the first 3 Ford-class carrier names were met with any real criticism. But not unlike President Reagan wanting a hook for his remarks at the dinner honoring John C. Stennis, on January 20th, 2020, at a Martin Luther King Day ceremony, Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Modly announced that the 4th ship in the Ford class, CVN-81, would be named for ship's cook 3rd Class Doris Miller, an African-American enlisted sailor who demonstrated heroism and valor during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. On that fateful day, Miller was collecting laundry on the battleship West Virginia when the attack started. Miller was ordered to the ship's bridge to aid the mortally wounded commanding officer and subsequently manned a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun until he ran out of ammunition. Miller was the first African-American sailor to receive the Navy Cross and is recognized as one of the first U.S. heroes of World War II. He died in 1943 aboard the escort carrier Lipscomb Bay when the ship was hit by a Japanese torpedo during the Battle of Macon in the Gilbert Islands. CVN-81 is the first U.S. aircraft carrier to be named for an African American and the first aircraft carrier to be named in honor of a sailor for actions while serving in the enlisted ranks. It's the second Navy ship to be named for Miller. The first was FF-1091, a Knox-class frigate that was decommissioned in 1991. The usual suspects agree that Miller's service warrants having a ship named after him, but in accordance with the Navy's own naming conventions, that ship would more appropriately be a destroyer and not a carrier. During the summer of 2020, social strife in cities nationwide forced lawmakers at both the state and federal levels to re-examine how they commemorate the Civil War by honoring those who served in the Confederacy. As a result of the recommendations of the Congressional Renaming Commission, the names of several bases and buildings on bases were ultimately changed. For instance, Fort Benning became Fort Moore, named for General Hal Moore, who was the hero of the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in Vietnam, and Maury Hall at the Naval Academy became Carter Hall, named for President Jimmy Carter, who's a Naval Academy graduate. Consistent with the Naming Commission's 2 recommendations for renaming ships, in February of 2023, Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro announced that the Ticonderoga-class cruiser USS Chancellorsville, CG-62, would be renamed the USS Robert Smalls. Then a few weeks later, Secretary Del Toro announced that the oceanographic survey ship USNS Marie, TAGS-66, would be renamed the USNS Marie Tharp. As anyone with even a passing knowledge of the Civil War knows, the Battle of Chancellorsville was General Robert E. Lee's greatest victory over the Union Army. So it's not surprising that CG-62 was targeted by the Naming Commission. When announcing the change, Del Toro said, quote, "The renaming of these assets is not about rewriting history, but to remove the focus on parts of our history that don't align with the tenets of this country, and instead allows us to highlight the events and people in history who may have been overlooked." End quote. Robert Smalls was born into slavery and became a skilled sailor and expert navigator. Smalls was conscripted in 1862 to serve as pilot of the Confederate steamer Planter at Charleston. On the 13th of May, 1862, he executed a daring escape out of the heavily fortified Charleston harbor with his family, other enslaved people, and valuable military cargo on board, and successfully surrendered Planter to the U.S. Navy. He ultimately became captain of Planter. After the Civil War, Smalls was appointed a brigadier general of the South Carolina militia, and from 1868 to 1874, he served in the South Carolina legislature. In 1874, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and served for 5 terms. In 2016, TAGS-66 was named USNS Maui after Commander Matthew Fontaine Maury, who is commonly known as the father of modern oceanography, but who also resigned from the U.S. Navy to accept a command in the Confederate States Navy at the outset of the Civil War. The USNS Maui was the only Navy vessel named after a Confederate military officer. During his rollout of that change last March, Del Toro said, quote, "I'm pleased to announce the former USNS Maui will be renamed in honor of a pioneering geologist and oceanographic cartographer, Marie Tharp. Her dedication to research brought life to the unknown ocean world and proved important information about the Earth, all while being a woman in a male-dominated industry." End quote. A vocal segment of the American public has come to believe that any commemoration of the Civil War is inherently racist. As a result, they demanded that the name of the USS Antietam and the USS Shiloh, other Ticonderoga-class cruisers, be changed as well. But the Naming Commission rejected those demands because while the Battle of Antietam was the deadliest day in American history, it wasn't a victory for the Confederacy. Rather, the outcome of the battle gave President Lincoln the legislative breathing room to introduce the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Battle of Shiloh, while very bloody, was a victory for General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army. And lastly, the Congressional Research Service report quotes a July 13, 2020 news item that states that U.S. Navy officials have also, quote, discussed renaming 2 aircraft carriers named after Southern U.S. legislators who advocated racial segregation, namely the USS John C. Stennis and the USS Carl Vinson, end quote. But to date, no official action has been announced. And you can rest assured that if the U.S. Navy decides to take action on either of those carriers, that we'll be talking about it here on the channel. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.